Good afternoon, and welcome to our first webinar in the World Languages Standards Update series. This webinar is focusing on an overview of the new standards, which we will be implementing starting in fall of 2025. My name is Anne Marie Gunter. I am your World Languages Consultant at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. As you can see, also on the World Languages team is my supervisor, Dr. Stacy Daniel. Today's agenda includes three main things. We're going to start with a welcome and introduction for everyone that's here with us live. Then we're going to have an overview of the new standards, specifically talk about the framework of the standards and strands, then the organization of the proficiency-based objectives, and finally, about how you read objectives for vertical and horizontal alignment. And then we'll end with some resources and wrap up. Before we begin, though, I'd like to make sure everyone has a copy of our new standards. As you can see on the screen, I have the QR code to our 2024 North Carolina Standard Course of Study for World Languages. I'm also going to put the shortened URL into the chat so that you can have it there. Of course, if you already have a copy of our standards, you're welcome to pull that up for further study as we go. That link is now in the chat, and this is a downloadable PDF document. It has 19 pages in case you want to print it out. Just be prepared. I'll pause for a moment, let everyone do that, and check for any questions. All right, let's get going. We'll begin with our welcome and introductions today. We're going to start with a couple of poll questions. So when we use WebEx like this, we have the ability to do poll questions. And I'm going to go ahead and open those. The first one we're going to do is, where are you in North Carolina? You're going to choose the region based on that map on the left-hand side of the screen. And there's also an option to tell us if you're currently outside of North Carolina and just tuning in from somewhere else. In just one moment, we'll have 45 seconds to do the poll. Let's go ahead. You should be able to click on your response in your control panel. This is the poll. All right, we got about 10 more seconds left. And now you should be able to see where everyone is at today, who's tuned in. It looks like we are spread across the state, including a few people who are maybe outside of North Carolina and joining us today. I see some of you are also adding it into the chat. If you didn't get a chance to respond to the poll, you could always add it into the chat. Thank you so much. All right. Well, as we move on, the next question I want to ask you is, when did you access our new standards for the first time? Was it in July when the joint statement with Arts Education was released, right after the State Board of Education meeting where the new standards were approved for both Arts Education and World Languages? Or was it in August when you saw the World Languages Installation News, the hashtag Setting the Standard newsletter? That was our first edition since we are in the installation phase. Or was it during back to school sessions or maybe meetings with your colleagues recently? Or perhaps it was in the Flank Catalyst newsletter. Or it may have been today on the agenda slide. I'll go ahead and open the poll. Let us know, when did you first access our new standards? Once again, we have 45 seconds. have about 5 seconds to go. All right, so let's take a look. We have a lot of you who accessed our standards already in July when they first came out officially, as well as a number of you who did so in August with the first newsletter with them. Also, a handful of you were able to do it during back to school meetings with colleagues, and a few of you were in this Flake Catalyst newsletter. In addition, several people got it today, and several people said they got it in other ways. So great. I'm glad to know everyone has a copy of our new standards because we're going to be studying them this year as part of our installation work. All right. Another thing we do in webinars often is activities like this. I call this waterfall in the chat because what we do is we answer a question or two and you type your answers into the chat, but you do not hit send until you hear me say, let's watch the waterfall of responses that go in the chat. I call this waterfall in the chat. You may have heard it called flood the chat, but I prefer waterfall, especially since we're in hurricane season here in North Carolina and we want to steer away from floods. So we're going to focus on waterfalls and we want to see a beautiful waterfall of these questions. Please type into the chat box, but don't hit send, your name, first and last, your current title with languages. So for example, Spanish teacher or French teacher, if that's applicable, or if you're a director or something like that, you can just type your title. Then your organization, your district, your charter school, your community college, your university. Now remember, you're typing this in the chat, but you're not hitting send yet. You have to wait until I say, let's watch the waterfall. So take a moment, just type your answers into those 3 questions, but don't hit send yet. Still see a few people hitting send too soon. Please wait. Just type your answers for all 3 questions in one single message in the chat box. But wait and don't hit send yet. Okay, finish typing your responses to the question. Are you ready? Let's watch the waterfall. All right, look at these that we've got coming up. Lots of people from all over North Carolina. Got some people from out of state who are going to be seeing at Flank. Got a lot of different languages represented. All right, very good. Welcome to all of you. Take a look around at the chat. Think about who you know and who you might want to connect with as we work together this year during the installation phase. All right, excellent job, everybody. Now remember how wonderful the chat works because we're going to be using it throughout to get some responses and to have sort of a discussion online together as we go through today. All right, let's get started with a framework of the standards and strands in our overview. The first thing we want to talk about is where we are currently. Because remember, we're still using our standards from the 2010 World Languages Standard Course of Study. Our 2010 framework, as you can see on the screen, is comprised of 4 standards and 3 strands. You see that screenshot from our administrator guides that shows the organization of our standards and strands for the state. You can see that we are aligned to the national standards, the World Readiness Standards for Language Learning, were often called ACTFL's 5 C's, and you see that with the 5 different rings there on the right-hand side of the screen. You're probably very familiar with that. Let me show you how our current state standards are aligned to those 5 C's that we refer to. And I've done some color coding here with these slides. So communication is essential. And our first 3 standards are the different modes of communication. So we've broken them out. Interpersonal communication is the first one. Interpretive communication is the second one. Presentational communication is the third one. Then culture is our 4th standard. So you can see that we have 4 standards from those 2 of the 5 C's from our national standards. Then our strands make sure that we're aligned to the other 3 C's. We have the connections to other disciplines strand, which is the connections C from the national standards. We have the connections to language and literacy strand, which is the comparison C from the national standards. And finally, we have the community strand, which is the community C from the national standards. So that's how we are aligned with our national standards, and that's how we ensure that what we're doing in North Carolina meets the needs of language learning across the board. Let's take a closer look at how our current standards are phrased and framed for the work that we do. As we say with the 4 standards, we have those modes of communication first and foremost. So we have standard number 1, interpersonal communication says use language to engage in interpersonal communication. Standard 2 is interpretive communication, understand words and concepts presented in the language. Standard number 3 is presentational communication, where we say use the language to present information to an audience. Notice all of these for our modes of communication are set up this way because we were using revised Bloom's taxonomy when we wrote the standards that were published in 2010. And finally, for culture, standard number 4, we have compare the student culture and the target culture. So those are our 4 standards as we currently have and will continue to use this school year. In the rewrite and the revisions, here's what our 2024 framework for our new standards is. First of all, it's much more compact. There are only 3 standards and 2 strands rather than 4 standards and 3 strands. Also, the standards have been switched around a little bit, but we are still aligned to our national standards and goals. Let's take a look. Again, you see that 5 C's visual there on the side. Please know that that has been updated too. So the color scheme is the same, but there's a little more information as well as some more details that help us understand these 5 C's. So for us, again, that C of communication is paramount, and we have broken it down into the 3 different communication modes for our 3 standards. So we start with the interpretive mode now for the 2024 standards, followed by the interpersonal mode, and then the presentational mode. Then the C of culture is actually in a strand, and that ensures that, like with any strand, cultures will weave throughout all 3 modes of communication and will be ever present in what we do with students and learning. Because it's in the Intercultural Communities Connections strand, or ICC. The connections to other disciplines is now part of the strand that's called Interdisciplinary and Literacy Connections. It's abbreviated ILC, but again, it's that interdisciplinary focus and our focus on literacy, which is where our comparison C comes in as well. So those 2 are woven together, connections and comparisons, into that strand of ILC, interdisciplinary and literacy connections. Then the community strand has been paired with the cultures C, and again, those 2 make up the intercultural communities connections strand that weave through everything. So in our new standards, things are just much more compact, but we are still aligned to our national standards and still focused on all the language skills that students need to build as they increase their proficiency in the language they're studying. Let's take a deeper dive on these standards. because now we are not using in the 2024 standards the revised Bloom's taxonomy. Instead, we're using the language of the necessitable, actable, can-do statements that look at proficiency. So standard number 1 is now the interpretive mode. As I said, that has been changed. So instead of being standard number 2, it's now standard number 1. And it says, understand, interpret, and analyze what is heard, read, or viewed. Notice that's a bit more specific about languages, and it's very inclusive. What can be heard with a spoken language, let's say, what can be read in general with any language, and what can be viewed either online or visual support or with signed languages like American Sign Language. That's standard number 1. Standard number 2, our interpersonal mode. Again, is a little more explicit because it's patterned after the necessitable, actable, can-do statements. And it says that for interpersonal, we interact and negotiate meaning in signed, spoken, or written conversation. And finally, standard number 3, our presentational mode, which is stayed in the same place as in our 2010 standards, says present information, concepts, and ideas to listeners, readers, or viewers. Again, we want our standards to be as inclusive as possible and to focus on the things that we know students need to do with each of these different skill areas or communication modes as they learn. So that's our layout of our new standards, the framework that we have with 3 standards and 2 strands. I also don't want to forget that when the standards writing team was using all of the feedback you'd given them, they made a very specific decision to change the order of the standards because they wanted our standards to reflect input first versus output. So students get input through the interpretive mode, standard number 1, before they're expected to give output in standard number 2 with interpersonal or standard number 3 presentational. Another way to say this is that they want to focus first on the receptive skills versus the productive skills that students are building. So that is a bit of a rearrangement of our standards and our thinking about learning. All right, well, now you've seen that. Again, we're going to do a waterfall in the chat, so I want you to type your answer to the following questions in a single message in the chat box, but don't click send until I say the magic phrase. So our questions are, which standard or communication mode is your favorite to teach and why? And this could be teaching students, this could be teaching colleagues if you do professional development, whichever you think is best. So which standard or communication mode is your favorite to teach? And you see them all there in our new arrangement, our new weave graphic, if you will, with interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational. And then why? Go ahead and type your answers, but remember, don't hit send yet. All right, let's take a few more seconds, finish up your message. Do not hit send yet until I say it. All right, let's watch the waterfall. All right, let's go. Good responses coming up here. Start with our interpretive communications. This is standard number 1. We have several people who picked that as their favorite. So we couldn't decide if interpretive was one of their 2 favorites. Also had a couple people who went for the strands that they liked the best because they wanted to incorporate that. But we've got people talking about interpretive because they said students understand much more before being able to produce. We've also got people saying with interpretive, they can use different types of resources, focusing on different learning styles of students, and that's helpful. We got people saying that they like interpretive because they can see students progress and interact with the target language. And that they love making connections between the L1 and L2 and cross-curricular. All right, so that's for standard number 1. Standard number 2 is interpersonal. And we've got several people saying they like that quite a bit. The person said interpersonal is their favorite because when the topic is engaging and motivating, learners are eager to exchange ideas and forget about trying to be perfect, resulting in their growth. Another person said they like interpersonal because it's the best way for students to use the language often and express opinions, feelings, interests, and so many other things. Another person said they like interpersonal because it's fun and allows students to engage in real-world interactions and develop practical skills. All right, great. And finally, presentational. Our standard number 3. We got people who just say they like presentation, like teaching that because they like to see their students using what they've learned. We got a couple other comments like that you can really see what students have learned with presentational. And other people say they like presentation because of the engagement opportunities with the L2, the second language. So different variety of things. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing what your favorite standard is to teach. But we all know that none of these standards are taught in isolation. There's a lot of overlap with what we do. And of course, we weave in different things as we go, including the strands. All right, next let's talk about the organization of the proficiency-based objectives in this overview of our new standards. In our 2010 framework of our current standards, we do have proficiency-based objectives. You see here on the left-hand side the actual proficiency scale, that inverted pyramid that goes from novice low at the very bottom in the beginning of language, all the way up to distinguished. Where you have people who use the language professionally, use their second language professionally in a number of ways. And you see right next to it, of course, our current weave graphic, or how our standards are organized with the 4 standards and 3 strands. So let's think about for a moment how we organize these. You know that in our current standards, we have 8 proficiency levels. We go from novice low through advanced mid. It's important to note that we don't go all the way to distinguished, because when the standards for 2010 were written, it was the decision of the standards writing team at that time that the highest level a student could reach of proficiency would be advanced mid. And that's reaching it in a K-12 program that is carefully sequenced and articulated, usually starting in the early years, like in kindergarten or somewhere in elementary, and studying that same language up until graduation from high school. That's quite a lift, as you know, as a teacher and as a language learner yourself. Keep in mind, too, that when we talk about proficiency-based objectives, what we're talking about is what students should know and be able to do with the language when they leave the classroom. That's the proficiency they've built. But that's compared to the performance that you've had them practice in the classroom to build those levels of proficiency, which probably go beyond where your outcomes are, but make sure that students are prepared to that level before they leave you and go on to the next class or out into the real world to use their language. So our current standards have 8 proficiency levels. There are 2 to 5 objectives per standard by strand intersection for each proficiency level. And I want you to stop and think about that for a moment, because you see this weave graphic we've got a similar weave graphic for our new standards. It's just more compact, right? But our current weave graphic with the 4 standards and 3 strands means that there are 12 intersections where you have 2 to 5 objectives located. And those 12 intersections with their 2 to 5 objectives are there for every proficiency level. So 8 proficiency levels. It's a lot of math. If you did that math, you would come up with over 200 objectives in our current standard course of study that was approved in 2010. That is a lot of objectives. Every teacher doesn't deal with every objective, obviously, because you only work with the objectives for the proficiency levels in the different skill areas that you're trying to get your students to by the end of your course or program. But regardless, it's a lot of objectives. In fact, when we did the review phase of the process for our standards, where we got feedback about our current standards, the consensus was that there were too many objectives and that there was lots of duplication and repetition with objectives in trying to make sure that we had objectives that met every standard as well as each strand at those different proficiency levels. So a lot of objectives, a lot of repetition. I see someone has a question about, so we don't need to meet all the objectives of the new courses. You'll need to meet the objectives of the new courses for the courses that you're teaching. Remember, in our current standards, what you often have is, let's say you're teaching a level 1 class for high school credit. Most of your outcomes are at the novice mid proficiency level. So you're responsible for making sure your students have met or mastered all of the objectives for those outcomes, those novice mid. Right now, what that would be is, at those 12 different intersections, 2 to 5 objectives for the novice mid proficiency level. It comes out to roughly 30 to 40 objectives per course. And so, yes, you're responsible for making sure your students meet the objectives for the course or program that they're currently in that have proficiency outcomes. But again, our current standards are kind of rough because they have, according to all the feedback we got, too many objectives and too much duplication and repetition. So the standards writing team heard that loud and clear and made changes for our 2024 framework. So this is our 2024 framework, just came up on the screen. Notice a couple things. First of all, we still use the actual proficiency scale, but they've updated it. You see there on the left, a revised version of the inverted pyramid, still going from novice low to distinguished, but a bit of a clarification. And if you look at the inverted pyramid and the colors that we're using, you can see that there's some overlap. So when you get to things like novice high and are reaching for intermediate low, or intermediate high and are reaching for advanced low, there's some cross back and forth about that as students build proficiency based on their performance in your classroom and the practice you give them in building their skills. So in looking at this, the standards writing team examined the feedback from focus groups and from surveys and from interviews very carefully about this. They also looked at a number of pieces of research related to K-12 outcomes and made some changes. So now we have 9 proficiency levels, from novice low through advanced high. One of the biggest findings was that our standards need to make sure they had more rigor. So we needed to increase the proficiency outcomes for a particular course or program, particularly the lower levels, so the beginning levels of language where you're dealing with like novice through intermediate, lower, mid outcomes. And they said there are students, particularly because of our early programs like dual language immersion to start at kindergarten, who are actually reaching much higher levels of proficiency, like advanced high, to the point that we needed to have that proficiency level in our state standards, even though we hadn't had it before. So now we have 9 proficiency levels. However, they also heard you loud and clear about the fact that we have too many objectives. So now there are only 2 or 3 objectives per standard by strand intersection for each proficiency level. So remember, before we said we had 12 intersections. Anytime a standard crosses a strand, you had 2 to 5 objectives. So now with only 3 standards and 2 strands, you have 6 intersections. And again, only 2 or 3 objectives per standard by strand intersection. So a lot fewer objectives that are a lot more focused on what they need to be and not duplicative or repeated in some way across strands or across the standard. I don't want you to have to do all the math, so here is an overview of our proficiency scale, again, going from novice low to advanced high now. You see on the first column there in 2010 how many objectives we had based on that 2 to 5 objectives per standard and strand intersection. And then what it's been switched to in 2024. So we went from having 259 objectives overall in 2010, and again, about 30 to 40 objectives for a particular proficiency level or set of outcomes, to in 2024 standards, having 14 at each proficiency level, and again, spread out across our 3 standards and 2 strengths. So we are down to 126 objectives, which means, like I said, about 14. So any given what you might be teaching and the fact that you might have different proficiency outcomes for different skill areas, I would say you would have anywhere from 14 to about 20 objectives that you'd be responsible for teaching any particular course or program. Pause here a moment and see if there are any questions about that. All right, so let's take a bit closer look to see the questions there, but let's take a closer look at those standards. Remember, one of the other changes was that we went from having the revised Bloom taxonomy as our framework to the necessary actual can-do statements. So now standard number 1, as I said, is understand, interpret, and analyze what is heard, read, or viewed. And we think about proficiency-based objectives for just, let's say, standard 1 for the moment. See that there's only 2 strand and standard intersections. And we're going to have objectives for each of those proficiency levels, from novice low up through advanced high. To give you just a glimpse of what this looks like for the interpretive mode of communication. You see here on the screen the objectives for the 2 objectives for the ILC strands, interdisciplinary and literacy connections, for standard 1. Notice that the task is foremost in this, and so each objective that you see for, let's say, a particular objective at any given proficiency level will always start with the task as foremost, and then whatever is sort of common for that objective as it goes across, because we tried to make these objectives much more concise so there wouldn't be duplication or repetition, and much more specific to what needs to happen. So interpretive communication, of course, deals with text and authentic text, and you see that the first objective in that strand for that standard always refers to informational text, and the second one always refers to fictional text. And that is true throughout that particular standard and strand. We also have an example of that particular standard in the Intercultural and Communities Connections, or ICC strand. Just one though, there's actually a second one as well here. But again, it focuses on the fact that there's a task first and foremost that students are doing, and that task will change based on the proficiency level and what the proficiency outcome is. But now we reference it as in historical and or modern texts from the target cultures. So some changes there in how things are phrased in the objectives. Some things that are, I think, fairly obvious and straightforward, like talking about the different kinds of text: informational, fictional, historical, and modern. But also smaller changes that you asked for. So for example, when we talk about culture now, culture is always plural, cultures with an S on it, because we know that in our globalized world, When we talk about culture within any language, we're talking about multiple cultures in different places in the world. So that's how they look and how they have been sort of compacted, if you will, and made more specific as adjectives. All right, so let's go for a waterfall in the chat and think about these changes you've just learned about. As we did before, you want to just type your answer to these questions in the chat box and wait for the phrase before you share. But we're going to make it a little bit different this time. So the first question is, what is the most interesting change to our state standards? And you can choose, you should start your answer just with the letter that you are choosing. Is it A, the compacted structure, B, the fewer objectives, C, the focus on input before output, D, the new proficiency level, E, the organization of standards or strands, or F, maybe it's something else. So start your answer out with the letter that you think is the most interesting change to our state standards, and then explain why you think that's the most interesting change. Go ahead and take care of that. And as we've done before, type your answer and wait for the phrase to share it in the chat. Please hold your answer until we're ready to go. Just go ahead and type, but don't hit send yet. Okay, finish up your response. Do not hit send yet. Let's just wait. All right, let's see. Let's watch the waterfall in the chat. All right, take a moment to read through the responses that people are sharing. All right, so we've got something for everybody here. We've got several A's where people are commenting on the fact that having a compacted structure makes it easier to follow, and having the intertwined strands, it makes it better as well. We've got people saying they like the fewer objectives, having a B answer, because that means there's more time to cover specific ones, more time to build that in different ways, and also because it's more specific to what students need to learn. We got people say they like C, focusing on input before output, because it makes sense. And they've commented on the fact that the way it was before was sort of interesting that it didn't do that. We've also got people who said D is the most interesting change because it just reflects the reality of what we have in our programs. We've even got a few E's. saying it, this new organization of standards or strands makes sense because it builds as the student's proficiency builds and outputs increase, which is evidence of their learning. I did not see anybody who chose F. I will keep an eye out for that. All right. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that today. Let's go ahead and move forward. All right, now we're going to take a look about how we read objectives for the vertical and horizontal alignment. And when I gave part of this presentation earlier this year, I talked about how do you read a standard. But for us, reading the standard is pretty straightforward since the three standards are all the same for everybody. What we really need to think about is reading the objectives at the different proficiency levels and thinking about vertical and horizontal alignment of those objectives across standards or throughout proficiency levels as students build proficiency. So first and foremost, I wanted to share with you how our objectives are set up and how this dot notation is done. So the abbreviation you see at the start of an objective has the information that tells you first what proficiency level it is, and we just use the abbreviations from novice low being NL up through advanced high being AH. So that proficiency level is first. It's always followed by the strand, either the ILC strands, Interdisciplinary and Literacy Connections strand, or ICC, Intercultural and Communities Connections strand. The next thing in the dot notation indicates the standard. So there's a 1 for standard 1, a 2 for standard 2, and a 3 for standard 3. And that's followed by the numbering of objectives. So for standard 1, there's always just 2 objectives in any given strand. So there's just be 1 and 2. And then in standard 2 and standard 3, there's either 2 or 3 objectives. Specifically in the ILC strand, there are 3 objectives for both standard 2 and standard 3. And in the ICC strand, there are just 2 objectives for standard 2 and standard 3, just like there is for standard 1. It may sound a little bit confusing, so let's take a look. If we just look at the dot notation in front of one of our objectives, like the one that came up on the screen, you see for a minute, it says nm.ilc.1.1. Take a moment and think to yourself, what does that tell you? What does that dot notation tell you about that objective? Obviously, you probably picked out NM is the proficiency level, novice mid. ILC is the Interdisciplinary and Literacy Connections, our strand. And then this is the standard 1 objective, and it's the number 1. So that 1 right after the strand tells you which standard it is. Likewise, you have IL.ICC.2.1. Take a moment, think about what this objective is and where it is located within our standards. I'm sure you figured out by now that this is at the intermediate low or IL proficiency level. It's the ICC strand, that Intercultural and Communities Connection strand. This is standard number 2, and it's the first objective in standard number 2. And finally, here's the last one, just to test you a little bit on dot notation. Sure you figured out by now? AH means it's advanced high, so this is one of our top proficiency level objectives. It's in the ILC strand, and it is standard number 3. It's the first objective for standard number 3 at that level. So that's how you read the objectives in the standard, that dot notation, that's what that's called. So when we talk about our objectives, one of the things we need to do as teachers, and we'll have plenty of time to do because this installation phase this year lasts the entire school year before we start implementing in the fall of 2025. We need to think about our vertical alignment. How does what we're asking our students to do change as we move from novice low all the way up to advanced high? And obviously with vertical alignment, you can think of it in different ways. I've got the inverted pyramid from actual on the one side here, but the way we usually read our documents, of course, is top to bottom. And so the first thing in the standards, of course, is novice low, and then it progresses through all of the different proficiency sublevels. So for example, when we think about vertical alignment, how do things change across the novice proficiency levels? You have to really focus on what changes, but also what stays the same across those sublevels. So when we look at these, think about how are the proficiency-based objectives vertically aligned and what changes or stays the same. Give you a moment because I'm going to reveal. First, the novice sublevels. So take a moment, and I specifically chose the ICC strand and standard number 1 so we can look at the same standard in the same strand and the first objective in that at each proficiency level. So take a moment to see how that task changes as students are building proficiency. Then, as students move from novice level, novice high, for example, into the intermediate levels, you see again there's some changes that happen. Some things stay the same, but the task is changing as we move up, and that's the first thing in the objective as we look at this. And finally, as we move from intermediate high into the advanced sublevels, again, there's some things that change, and there's some things that stay the same. Take a look. All right, so you just had a look at the ICC, or Intercultural Communities Connections strand for Standard 1 with the first objective across all 9 proficiency levels. That's a lot, but you'll have time to study that and others as well as you go forward. That's looking at vertical alignment. You could also think about horizontal alignment. So for example, you could think about going from novice low in any of our standards and looking at those standards as they go across and as you work with them in different ways for your courses and programs. Likewise, there are people who want to start at the end, the advanced high, and go the other way. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. And I want you to think about the way you will start to look at these standards, strands, and specifically the objectives as you think about how that will impact your local curriculum that you write with standards-based objectives and how you will share that with others about what you've learned. All right. Here's another waterfall in chat. I think we're getting good at this now, but this one is kind of different. What I want you to answer in the chat in a single message is, what is one thing you learned about the new standards today that you learned? Feel free to start your response with TIL, which means today I learned. Most of us know that with, abbreviations and texting and that kind of thing. So TIL with whatever you learned today about the new standard, just one thing. Then who you're going to share your TIL with after this broadcast. And finally, why did you choose that person or group to share it with? So remember, type your response in a single message in the chat box, but don't hit send yet. Just wait. All right, let's go ahead and work on that. Okay, be finishing up your response for the waterfall and chat, but don't send it yet. All right, let's watch the waterfall. All right. I hope you're reading through the responses about what people learned today about our new standards, who they're going to share that with, and why they chose that person or group. It looks like there's a lot of folks who are taking this information back to their PLCs or their departments or other folks. And that's great. You're always welcome to share. I did see one question about, are the standards available vertically, like we talked about? So not at this time. At this moment, the standards document that we started looking at, obviously the beginning of the broadcast, is the only way in which they've been published. However, we are convening a standards resources team to develop our resources. Some of the resources like our instructional toolkit components that you've grown accustomed to, as well as other resources. And I know that one of the suggestions has been to present the standards in different ways. So we could share that with them when they begin their work. All right, well, take a look at, as I said, what's in the chat. And I'm noticing our time. I've got a few more things to share with you, but I think we've got time to finish up today and take any additional questions that we've got. So thank you again for sharing and the waterfall in the chat. Let's go ahead and move to our resources and wrap up for today now that we've had our overview of the new standards. First and foremost, I want to share with you that because you came to this webinar today, you're going to get a brand new handout that we have just developed for our 2024 Standard Course of Study for World Languages. This is the quick overview. That's what we call it. It's sort of a frequently asked questions or FAQs component. It's a one-pager. It's got 12 questions and their responses about our new state standards. Some of what we discussed today is covered in here, but it's got links and things like that to other parts of the website, the World Languages Resources Hub, that would be helpful. And some of it is information about the topics that we'll be covering soon in future webinars. So for example, our proficiency outcomes document and some of the resource tools. So I've just put that in the chat, the 2024 Standard Course of Study for World Languages quick overview, that one pager. Please take a moment and download that. It's a PDF document. Of course, you can see with a lot of links. We've also got the QR code on the screen so you can access it that way as well. All right, I see several people are saying they've got that. And again, because it is a PDF, you can send it along to folks as an attachment if you want, or just send them the link. That shortened URL you see on the screen, go.ncdpi.gov/WL quick overview. And as we know, with all shortened URLs, capitalization is important. So make sure that you've got it the way it's been set up so that you can share it with whoever you would like. Also, I wanted to make sure that everyone was familiar with our World Languages Resources Hub. This is where a lot of our resources for teachers, classrooms, administrators, programs, and so forth get published. This is a Canvas hub, if you will, or Canvas course. It's not really a course per se, it's just a hub. But that means if you have Canvas, you can bookmark this site on your Canvas dashboard so that you can go to it quickly and easily. I'm going to put in the chat that link to the World Languages Resources Hub that you see there. For this broadcast, I want to point out a couple things about our World Languages Resources Hub. We are still organizing it with the 4 different categories. So you see on the left-hand side there's a whole section for World Languages Standards Instructional Toolkit Resources. Then there's a section for teacher and classroom resources. There's a third section for administrative program resources, and then there's professional learning. For today's broadcast and the topics we've been talking about with the overview of our new standards, specifically, there are two sections. One on our national standards, using that new visual about the 5 C's, and one on proficiency outcomes materials, using again that new inverted pyramid visual. And you see in the national standards, there's information about those world readiness standards for learning languages, which were published in 2015. There's a 2-page summary, and there's a short video that you can access as well. There's also some links to some other materials in our national standards. For example, our standards for classical languages, which was last updated in 2017, and our standards for learning American Sign Language, which were updated in 2022. All of those are aligned to our standard course of study for world languages, but you can go to the actual documents themselves and look at that alignment for yourself to see how that's aligned to our new standards as we move forward. Also, in the proficiency outcomes space, you see that there are several resources. There are the new Active Proficiency Guidelines that were just published this year. In fact, thankfully published in time for the standards writing team to use them as they were finalizing all of the materials for the standards document. There's also some posters like the inverted pyramid, the levels with proficiency functions, and the oral proficiency of the workplace poster. You can download those from the actual website for free. You just have to register your email address. There's also a link to the Necessify for Can-Do statements, which were last updated in 2017. And a link to those, again, that's the framework we use for our standards, that Necessify for Can-Do statements. Those are being updated again, and North Carolina has been in the discussion about those updates. So when they come out for 2024 or 2025, we will post those as well. And that'll be another tool we can use to understand proficiency, especially as we have our students work on their performance in the classroom and walk out of our classrooms with a proficiency level that they can function with in the real world. All right, I see a couple questions, and I'm going to answer those as we go. Someone had asked, will there be any authentic material shared with us in our target languages? Yes, in fact, that is already part of the World Languages Resources Hub. If you go out to the hub under Teacher and Classroom Resources, there's actually a list of language-specific information, and there are links to authentic materials, authentic texts that are available for you, either videos or text or articles or any kind of number of other things that are available for you with that. I see a question about, say, textbooks, but I'm going to answer that here in just a moment, so please bear with me as we get to that. I did see a picture too about how do you bookmark this site on Canvas. Take a look on the right-hand side of the screen. If you want to bookmark the site on your Canvas dashboard, find the link that says join this course that you see pictured there on the right-hand side. And when you click on that, you could bookmark it that way if you have your own Canvas dashboard. If not, you're just welcome to bookmark this in the way that you do in your browser. All right, so that's the World Languages Resources Hub. Also, because someone asked about textbooks, I wanted to remind everybody about our World Language Installation Timeline. This is our roadmap that you've probably seen in a number of publications that looks at the whole standards review, revision, and updating process. Notice on the left-hand side, we have already passed through the review process in 22-23 when we reviewed our current standards and gave feedback. We've already passed through the revision phase, which was last year, 23-24, when the standards writing team, or SWT, created our new standards, and we sent drafts out for feedback and finalize them. Now we are in the installation phase, and that's why our little car, if you will, is on the road there in the middle. So in 24-25, we're spending the entire school year as NCDPIs and PSUs, public school units like districts and charter schools, preparing for implementation. Once we're through this school year, we will start implementing our new standards in all K-12 classrooms starting in the 25-26 school year. That's our initial implementation. And it's at that point, after we start our initial implementation, that we're actually going to look at textbook adoption for world languages. So world languages, arts education, and other areas that are on this same timeline as we are, we'll be doing textbook adoption somewhere in 2025, 2026. So take a look at that and look for information about that as it becomes available. All right, so let's take a look at installation to really consider what we're doing this year. First of all, there's a World Language installation timeline. If you haven't already seen it, you can go to it now using that QR code or using that shortened URL you see on the screen, which I'm going to put in the chat box right now. This is a document, the timeline, that is actually a Canva document because it changes constantly. So don't download this one because you might miss an update. But when you go over to it, you can click on all the things that are there as well as the things that are being added. So for example, our webinars are there for this whole webinar series and the registration links. But you'll see those as we go throughout the year. A couple things to keep in mind is that the webinar series goes the whole year, but there will also be other opportunities. There'll be conference presentations that are happening throughout. You can see that on the installation timeline. And there'll be a series of in-person regional workshops in the spring about our new standards and the support resources for them before we begin implementation in the fall of 2025. So make sure that you check our World Languages installation timeline periodically. And again, you see, not only do we have a shortened URL, but we also have a QR code to go to that. This is our World Language Standards Update webinar series you see here on the screen. Now, most of you must have found this already, obviously, if you're here with us today. But I did want to make sure I shared it with you again because I want you to share it with others as well so we can get everybody here. I'll put that in the chat so you've got it. A couple of things to note. You see we have 4 webinars in this series, and they spread from September, the one we've just done, through early May. With each one, the slide deck, recording, handout, and links will be posted in the World Languages Resources Hub under Professional Learning by the end of the week of whenever that broadcast is. So this week, because it is September 16th, by September 20th on Friday, you will be able to access, again, that slide deck that we've been using, the recording of our broadcast, the handout we had was the quick overview of our FAQs of our standards, and the links that we've been using. That'll all be posted for you to do some further review with, or even adapt for local use. Maybe you want to give a presentation to your PLC or your department, or just share with others. So all of that will be available. And that's how we'll do the webinar series throughout the year. All right, we are to wrap up just in time, by the way. So before we wrap up, I want to know what other questions do you have about the new standards that I can answer for you today. Please go ahead and pop them in the chat so we can see what's on everybody's mind or things that we haven't answered about the new standards in this overview. As you're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and do some of the other wrap-up materials. Again, watch materials from this broadcast. We talked about posting the slide deck, the recording, the handouts, and all that, but also I will submit your request for the certificates of attendance. Those of you who attended this live get a certificate of attendance, and you should receive those in email as an attachment by mid-October. So look for those then. It might get done sooner, but I can't say for sure because I have to submit the request for those who attend so that those certificates can be sent out. Also, I'd like for you to submit the evaluation form that exists for our World Language webinar series. Here you go. And again, there's a QR code as well as a shortened URL. Put that in the chat. And I would encourage you to submit that because that looks at what we shared today, but also what your needs are for the future, either for the webinars that we've already got planned as part of the World Language Standards Update series, or other topics that you'd be interested in related to our new standards and implementing them in your local curriculum. So please go ahead and fill out that evaluation form. Finally, you're always welcome to contact us. Again, you see my name, Anne-Marie Gunter, your World Languages Consultant. I'm happy to talk with you about anything. And we even have an opportunity to have a one-on-one meeting. So if there's a topic that you really want to drill down and discuss at some length, I invite you to connect with me. Go ahead and see my calendar online and set up a time to meet one-on-one to talk about whatever you'd like to discuss with our new standards or our policies around world languages or something like that. I appreciate all of you coming today. We had a sort of a full house today, so it was nice to see everybody and for sharing your feedback on the waterfall, the chat responses as well. I'm going to wish you a good evening. If you still have another question or you want to chat, we certainly can do that. But we are coming up on our time as far as 4 o'clock to 5:15, so I want to stay true to that. So thank you for attending today. I appreciate you being here, and I look forward to seeing you at our next webinar or maybe at one of the sessions on the road of the conferences that are coming out.